and welcome everyone, and particularly to our speakers. If you were with us in the earlier session, we had a lively time with Sadie Morgan was running chairing the group, and we had a really good discussion centering around what we might call the science, the facts behind the reason to consider retrofit and renovation. And so we're all now terribly frightened, and hopefully capable of making some firm commitments once we hear from our speakers this morning on including their examples of what they've been involved with. We have our first up person, if I can put it that way, is Helen Grimshaw. Now, Helen's a senior sustainability consultant with URBED, and you'll gather that I'm rushing around trying to open up other things. She cuts her work is cutting across a wide range of projects, ranging from assessing the sustainability credentials of new developments and reviewing their own master plans, research and guidance and improving energy efficiency of housing stock, etc. So it's sustainability that's Helen's main focus. With a background as a human geographer, our key interest is in the interaction between people and their surroundings. I hope that's a reasonable resume to say, Helen, and I'll hand over to you now for your talk, please.
Great, thank you very much. Right, let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see the right screen? Is that?
Yes,
yeah, looks good.
Great. Yes, thanks very much for having me today. So yeah, my background is geography. I'm a geographer by background and proud of it. But yeah, I work across kind of a range of our sustainability and retrofit projects at URBED. So the title of my brief segment is People Powered Retrofit. I will talk a bit about a service that has that very name, which is the fruits of a long-standing collaboration between URBED and Carbon Co-op. But I just also want to touch on a few other aspects of retrofit, both in private and social housing, and how I really kind of think that people and process need to be at the heart of that. So firstly, let's talk private housing. So obviously this is a huge chunk of our housing stock. Very variable in building type and in householder motivations and means. And it's also where our big consumers of energy are concentrated. So, you know, if we're going to talk about having an equitable transition to zero carbon, then it's a sector that we really do have to tackle. So over the past couple of years, we've been developing, testing and piloting an end-to-end service for pioneering householders, specifically owner occupiers. And I guess, what do I mean by pioneering? Well, these kind of early adopters, as we call them, are often willing to go first, kind of smoothing the way for the rest of us to follow. They're often not dependent on financial incentives or grants, so they have kind of means of doing this work, and they're often very kind of vested and driven in terms of project outcomes. We know that there's significant demand from these householders, thanks in part because obviously there's a growing awareness of the climate emergency and that we need to take action. But there's actually very little support for them at present to kind of overcome those barriers. So People Powered Retrofit is this service that we've been developing to help them overcome that. So we're now at a stage where we've kind of piloted it. It's generating income. There's demand, and we have a community share issue out at the minute to help us kind of grow the service even more. But ultimately our aim is to build a trusted retrofit service provider. So it's not about directly contracting that work, but it's about working with householders to help them navigate what can often be quite complex decision making, simplifying the process, and also ensuring that the work that gets done is of a high quality. Also other things around that, which are kind of developing new open source software services. So that will allow us to support other retrofit designers and organisations to kind of meet that demand that we know is there. And a supply chain training programme to help us develop an appropriately skilled, locally based workforce, which we know is a big barrier for householders at present. So this is a nice picture of my colleague Lorenzo, who also happens to have done a kind of retrofit to their home over many years. So I guess what the point here is that whilst our services aims to be responsive, oops, I think my monitor's going a bit funny. Whilst our service aims to be responsive to different needs, it is underpinned by some key principles, and those are kind of the ones that I've got on the slide here. So when we talk about retrofit, we are talking about whole house, and that's not necessarily that people would do all of that work in one go, but it's about having this whole house plan and thinking about the home as a set of interacting systems that need to be considered together and not in isolation. So they're very tangible things like energy use and the building condition, but they're also kind of those less tangible things and values and motivations around, you know, what the householder wants, also other things around aesthetics and heritage value, etc. Whole system, so we very much see homes as part of a wider energy system and not as energy islands in themselves. So we're particularly focused on reporting energy use as measured in the home rather than kind of abstract notions of carbon emissions at a particular point in time. And that also means thinking about, you know, a home and what we do to it and the impact that that then has on the wider grid and what's happening elsewhere in the energy system. Very much fabric first, so we prioritise repairs, insulation, draft proofing, ventilation ahead of generation. And we do that because we believe that done well, that really does reduce the risk of a performance gap between what you design and what actually gets built and is used. As many core benefits, so obviously fabric first can deliver real improvements in comfort and health, and also kind of protecting the building fabric as well when you do that well. Science-based, we set ambitious targets for deep retrofit and kind of, as I mentioned, this whole house plan, so that people can understand the full range of possibilities, but we do that in a way that kind of plans scenarios so that householders can understand how they might tackle that work in a more manageable phase. And then other things on there, obviously, ultimately kind of fabric first, obviously, then you get into the realm of how do you heat the home, and obviously fossil-free heating is important, but only once kind of appropriate and affordable. And also we don't advocate for things like wood-based heating either for a number of reasons, including air quality and things like that. And then there's other things as well around upfront impacts, you know, thinking about embodied carbon and energy, you know, pollution, toxicity, health impacts of materials, etc. Social housing, so obviously what are the opportunities and challenges in a social housing context for that kind of thing? Firstly, they are different. This is a sector that's had some exposure to retrofit over many years in various guises, but I think arguably as an industry and in policy, we've not really capitalised on the learning and momentum from that enough. That said, there are quite a few things happening at the minute. So there's stuff around social housing decarbonisation programme, and we're working on a couple of the demonstrator projects for that at the minute, where the ambition is to move towards more of this kind of whole house, slightly deeper level of retrofit. So we're working to get homes down to a 50 kilowatt hour space heating demand target. So it's very much focused kind of on fabric and ventilation. But in other cases, the housing providers also kind of then pulling in heat pumps as well. This kind of project for us as kind of advisors and designers allows us to take a slightly different approach in design, because you've got kind of volumes of homes. So we can take an approach that's more based on house types, which has the potential to obviously streamline processes and make it more efficient. But there are challenges. Definitely. So firstly, I guess we're trying to integrate a lot of this work with industry standards around retrofit, and in the UK. They are still evolving, they're not like a finished product. So that means that we sometimes kind of end up chasing compliance whilst the standards and the infrastructure around it are still evolving. Data is a big thing, how it's collected, how it's stored, how it's used. For example, on a lot of these projects are going to generate loads of really valuable monitoring data. How can we do that in a way that delivers value to housing providers over the longer term? And how can they proactively use that data as part of their wider housing stock management and resident engagement? How can we plan work in a way that minimises disruption for residents? How can these packages interact with other investment and maintenance cycles that they've already got going on? And also kind of capacity and skills to deliver, I think is really important. So particularly around evaluation, which we're a big believer in, but some of these projects, especially where there's external funding involved, there is quite a high research burden, and that ultimately ends up on residents a lot. So it's kind of a fine balance between getting that fatigue and level of engagement. But obviously there's other opportunities for this type of project as well. So social housing schemes in particular are often geographically clustered. So there's opportunities for us to kind of go beyond the bricks and mortar of an individual home, start looking at the streets, how the homes work together as a neighbourhood. So this is an example from a bid we did a few years ago. And it was good because the client's brief was not simply focused on energy reduction, but they really saw the project as an opportunity to improve the area, kickstart its regeneration. So we were looking at kind of improvements to public realm, reorganising, rationalising access routes, kind of improving security, and other things like, could we then create spaces that would give them more kind of communal areas, kind of areas of green space as well. And this approach really could be taken across a lot of our housing stock, really. If we're going to tackle the energy use, carbon emissions, then, we're also tackling other issues around fuel poverty, but also kind of just general well-being, quality of life issues. Also loads of scope for retrofit and community-led housing. So this is an example from Anfield in Liverpool, and this is a community land trust called Home Baked. So they plan to refurbish this row. It's 9 existing terraced houses on an existing street. And on the end of that street, which you can't quite see, there is a bakery that they've already kind of refurbished and made into a really successful community business. So it's community-led development. So obviously people are very much at the heart of that. A very participatory design process with the community and the CLT. And ultimately it's about providing affordable and healthy homes and space for local businesses as well. So the reuse of the buildings is very central to the whole of their aspirations. So this is just a little cross section of that same project. So we'll be looking to achieve that through a fabric first approach, similar to what I talked about with people powered retrofit. So obviously high levels of insulation, draft proofing, glazing, with an aim to kind of reduce heat loss by about 80% in comparison with a standard terrace in that area. And as I've talked about already, obviously it's more than just energy and carbon. So it's also thinking about daylighting, overheating risk, water, space, accessibility and inclusive design, and also kind of, outdoor space as well. And then nearly lastly, I just want to also briefly mention flood recovery and resilience, which could dovetail with retrofit if we did kind of do that thing of thinking a little bit more holistically and joining the dots. So with the change in climate, obviously we're going to be contending with more flood events, and that's not going to be from just kind of obvious sources such as rivers. Surface water flooding, is likely to become more of an issue. So this is an example from some work we did in Cumbria, where obviously the households there have experienced not only a one in a lifetime event, but they've been repeatedly flooded to quite a significant extent. So there's a huge amount of damage and waste that kind of is generated by those events, not just physically to the buildings, but also, the social impacts of that, the displacement and the turmoil that generates when someone's uprooted from their home. But when those homes are reinstated, what we often end up with doing is just putting them back to how they were. So like for like, meaning the properties, just put back, same old plaster, same finishes. There's a lot of reasons why that happens. Insurance kind of policies are part of that, but also obviously the need to get people back into their homes quite quickly. And beyond that, sometimes basic stuff gets put back in, usually because there's a few little grants around to help people kind of try and keep the water out next time. But actually kind of resilience measures, which are rarely done, do make more sense where you're going to have these kind of repeat flood events. And that generally is a much better approach, you know, allows for less strip out, it's easier to clean up, and it's quicker then for someone to get back into their home. Obviously that work requires a little bit more planning, but existing building supply chains, you know, are well suited to that kind of work. And in doing this, would that not also be an ideal time to be thinking about how do we make these homes more efficient at the same time? And again, that's kind of rarely happening, but there are some good examples, particularly up in Cumbria, of organisations that are kind of trying to push forward that agenda a little bit. So that's my final slide. So I guess that's the key point really about how it's all connected. So we don't have the time, and it is just downright inefficient for us not to be joining the dots more between all of these different things. So yes, obviously retrofit is about decreasing energy demand, heating and powering our homes in a way that's more compatible with what else is going to be happening in the energy system. But it's also massively about, you know, our health and well-being as residents, how resilient our housing is to future climatic events, and that we should be having conversations about retrofit as much as about a street and neighbourhood level thing, you know, rather than individual homes. So I guess my three takeaways are, number one, our homes are part of wider systems, and we need to be connecting the dots between these different issues and agendas. Number two, we do know how to do good retrofit already. There's, you know, products, methods and skills that exist. We just need to focus on process to scale that up, increase capacity and expertise across the industry. And thirdly, that people need to be at the centre of that process and part of the design process. So obviously one size doesn't fit all, but, you know, that needn't be a barrier to getting the job done. And then that's my last slide, just a few links to those different projects that I mentioned there.
Thank you, Helen. I also understand that you have other meetings you've got to get along to, so I think
it's more childcare.
Is it? Oh well,
yeah,
a very important meeting.
It is a very important meeting.
I think there was one of the. It was interesting that it's the second time already this morning that the phrase "one-stop shop" has come up. And Kieran was saying earlier that that was something that he thought would work well within potentially within local communities, etc. Because I think there's been a lot of discussion about, as you put it down for your third bullet point, as it were, in conclusion, it's the people, it's the communities. If they don't make the transition, then nothing's going to really change. Certainly not within the timescales we're talking about. Do you envisage the sort of one-stop shop thing happening in some way or other? How does it function with your studies?
Yeah, so that people-powered retrofit project is, so we've been piloting it. So we've had householders going through that as we've been developing the service. So they've been kind of, there's a whole community of members at Carbon Co-op who are very engaged on climate issues and household energy reduction. So there've been people there that have already had an interest in retrofit and who've been willing to be kind of guinea pigs, if you like, while we've kind of been building these tools and the systems around it. So that is already happening. I think the big challenge is we know that there's a lot of demand from householders, very engaged householders who want to do this. There's a bottleneck in terms of designers, all the other professionals that you need around kind of M&E and heating and but also kind of that coordination and project management, so that ability to hold people, hold the hand a little bit, help them with procurement, help them understand what good retrofit looks like, what what support can we give them during construction to make sure that the work that goes in is actually done in a good way. And then helping them also to understand what happens at the end, you know, like, did it work? Did it actually work? Are you more comfortable? You know, there's a lot of organisations that we're working with who are interested in replicating either parts or kind of the whole service as well in their own locality as well. So,
can I just say, there's Jelly has asked a question along similar lines, and if I can just read it out, it says, are residents trained in retrofitting their homes? And will you be scaling up this approach?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, a big bit of what Carbon Co-op do is around not just building these kind of services and tools, but also engagement with householders. So there's a lot of really good stuff that they've done around, you know, helping people understand heat pumps, you know, helping people understand retrofit, you know, right from the very kind of basics through to the more technical stuff. And there's also some householders who are happy to tackle some of this kind of DIY as well. And there's kind of training courses that we've been developing, which is kind of geared at like general building trades, but also might be suitable for competent DIYers as well. So yeah, learning and kind of sharing that and disseminating that through a community of like-minded individuals is very much part of the whole approach.
Okay, well, I mean, thank you very much. I think everybody's taking quite a bit out of the the idea that you have to look at not just simply being a property or a series of properties. They have to be looked at in a much wider perspective. I think we'll let you get away to your child taking care of tasks, and we can keep moving on here. But thank you very much indeed, Helen. That was great and a very good start to this second session. Thank you. Our next speaker is Thomas.
Hello, good to see you.
Hi, and Thomas, I'll try Kraubitz, is that correct?
Yes, Kraubitz is correct.
That's near enough anyway, perhaps, sorry. Yeah. Thomas is Director and Head of Sustainability Europe at Buro Happold. He has been advising public and private clients throughout in different cities, districts, portfolio levels, and is an architect, urban and regional planner. He worked with a great deal of names that I can't pronounce, but also with Jan Gale. So I'm sorry, you'll have to do that, Thomas, when you come on. And joined Buro Happold in 2010. Working as a co-initiator of the German Sustainable Building Council and a member of the Board of Directors. You have also studied at Harvard, MIT, etc. So perhaps that will come up in your talk. So can I just hand over to you, Thomas, please?
Thanks so much, Andrew. Very pleased to be here today, and it's already been fantastic to hear Helen and also yes, a great comments. So I have only a few slides today because I want to give you a little bit more insights on social housing in Germany and rejuvenation. So it fits very well because Helen's dealing with her family. My little one just turned 5 years today. So I'm also thinking about how would you do things different if you were 5 years old, and what can you bring as change. So I put a few slides together. I tried to share, and so it should work actually. Does it work? Do you see the slide?
Yes.
Yes, very good. So thanks for that. In case there are any questions on the way through, so I try to be on time, yeah, to use it 10 minutes, but maybe 7-8 minutes for the talk and then for a bit of feedback and questions. Rejuvenation of social housing. The topic I've put in is basically we have a big challenge. Obviously, we know in the background you see Berlin, and I'm based in Berlin, even so you see the waterfall from the Singapore Changi Airport in my background, but it's I'm sitting in Berlin. And in Berlin, we have over 2 million apartments. but we are short of 80,000 apartments by year. So as Buro Happold, we're involved in quite a lot of urban scale projects, and we try to bring in a difference and to also work on large scale housing projects. Interestingly enough, out of those 2 million housing units that we have in Berlin, 800,000 are owned by large housing agencies and portfolio holders. So, which is, yeah, we could say pretty much close to half of it. The other topics that we have is that Berlin and I would say also the biggest part of Germany is, let's say, 95% built up already. So we have to deal with the urban pattern. So what's on there is a scheme we developed over the last 2 years that we present to the big housing agencies and tell them, well, you know, that's what we can bring in as a difference. You see the first one is health and well-being. Not only over the last 1.5 years, but in general, we see there is a big increase in demand on health in housing. Not only is that people understand that it's good to have access to nature, so that means housing with balconies, terraces, or even a garden are much needed and much in demand. At the same time, and that's normally, I mean, it's not new, that's the last years, I could say, since the start of suburbia, people with the idea saying, well, we love downtown, but we also love to have our garden, moving outside, then taking on the hassle of commuting. At the end, what you normally gain was having your own garden. And there's good studies from Wuppertal Institute, which is saying, well, you know, you have an increase in health if you have your housing plus a garden. But at the same time, you have a decrease in health by commuting. So, and that's a dilemma you're in, that you say, I want to have green and I want to have space, but at the same time, I don't want to commute necessarily. And that's bringing all cities in Germany at serious issues right now, because topics like row houses or other more innovative models are some things that you would like to see downtown. And the background image, yeah, it's Tiergarten, one of the big parks. Berlin is, I think, the greenest capital in Europe, if I'm not wrong. We have a lot of green area, but housing with green is a different story. So what we do is we look at urban comfort, we look at sustainability frameworks often enough. That's just on making places livable. At the same time, we look at resiliency on urban climate, disaster, and stranded assets. Stranded assets is often a topic, especially in Berlin, where we have, even so after 30 years of reunification, we still have a lot of areas that are up there for grasp and for housing developments, and it should be stable in prices. Stable in prices, just to mention that we have one big developer we're working with, and they said, well, we have to reduce that second rent. And second rent is all of the operational costs. And so that's one of the topics we're interested in by bringing in more energy efficiency, by you know, looking at facade, looking at compactness, and so on. And the last one is circularity. So we understand that materials you use for housing, you're not only touching once, you're probably going to see them in another situation after a lifetime of a building is done. And so we look a lot at life cycle modeling, life cycle assessments, and most of the big housing owners, they are in business. Like I have one in Frankfurt, and I'm going to show you that project in a minute, but they are out there for 100 years, some of them. So they are interested in the long run, which is an interesting part for us as a firm, because we can look at large scale on cities. So what you see there is the city of Cologne, and we're currently involved in 2 of those projects, the larger ones. And the city of Cologne, yeah, it goes back to the Roman time and so on. So it's one of the big cities, but you see all of those developments are by one big, well, actually 2 big development agencies that are predominantly looking at bringing in housing and a bit of office space. So you see there is cities go on for an overhaul, but all of those are inner city redevelopments, except one in the north, but others are all inner city redevelopment. So that's a big topics. And what we try to do, and that's what you see there from the Cologne project, we look at formerly industrial use areas. Yeah? And you see there is a bit of legacy in there with that grain and brings in a bit of heritage and identity, but trying to bring that together with new lifestyle, with new ideas on how we want to use public space and see open, how we want to go back to community and having social interaction, physical social interaction. So all of that's what we try to bring in projects downtown. And that's why we have it as a rejuvenation. Often enough, we're dealing with existing building stocks. We try to make it more efficient, yes, but at the same time, densification is an issue, adding floors on top of existing buildings, changing functions and being more agile in the way we program. And just to show you one project that's not particularly pretty at first sight, but one of the kind of a stereotypical, you could say, a Xerox development for housing rejuvenation in Frankfurt. And that's for a big Frankfurt housing agency that we are quite lucky to be involved in. First, we gave some training because I said we want to do something on being more sustainable. What can we do? How can we act? And so we brought in a bit of training sessions, and then we said, let's look at your portfolio and try to do something different. So the photovoltaic on top of it, that's what you see. All right, okay, so they've done something on it, but in the background on that part, if you see, say extended the building, not horizontally, but not vertically. So that's one of the options. They just figured out that there is enough infrastructure and space around there that we can add buildings. And it could be quite nice and can be quite nice. There you see the new part on the right side, the existing part. And from the existing parts, it's 1950s housing. It's social housing. It's not really of the highest caliber when it comes to building materials used and so on, but it's solid. It's a building that was well maintained. And what's one of the most important parts, it has a population that is there already for quite a time. I think they have hardly any changes in the recent years. So people like to stay there and to contribute to the overall success of a project. So you can think about extending projects, even though they're not really pretty. They're not necessarily portfolio projects, but they do bring a lot. One aspect they bring is you can densify neighborhoods. You can also steer development. You can introduce, and here we introduced small shops. We introduced what is it called, an edible settlement, so you can plant your own vegetables there. We brought in a bit of we could say festivities and artwork and so on, and that's one of the topics that really help to bring those housing development, large scale housing developments to the next generation and to rejuvenate them. So I stopped sharing there. Just wanted to give a bit of an idea on what we're doing there. But in general, all big cities in Germany have the challenge to increase housing. Germany is interesting for many people to come from abroad. We're getting very international. Our office in Berlin, yeah, we have 27 nations right now, over 130 people strong, still looking for new colleagues. So, and we're working in cities, but also building scale. And we see that housing is one of the big topics to work with, and not only high-end housing, but also really mass housing, social housing, large developments, because that's where you can bring in also change, and we can use the tools we have, technologies that we have at hand and developed to really bring in benefit. So last but not least, health as well. So it's one of my slogans I have, in current times, that all of the rejuvenation needs to come with an improve of health, access to open space, and also improvement of happiness. Happiness is not always something you can plan for, but with planning you can support it. And so I just want to give back to Stephen, and that's just not to take too long on that slot, but very, very pleased and grateful to be there. And thanks for tuning in.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I think the intention here is we'll go through our remaining speakers, and then we'll get a general question and answers at the end, if that's okay with you, Thomas.
Wonderful. I'm around.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that excellent chat. And I'm trying to dig up my list and program because I can never remember it. Oh, somebody I do know well coming up next is Nick Walker from Collective Architecture, and it's I think there'll be some examples that you might recognize if you're here in the earlier session this morning that Nick might well take us through. So Nick, are you there, and can I hand over to you, please?
I am here, yes, indeed. And I'm just going to try and share screen. So if you just bear with me a second. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. I have panicked and put together a ridiculous amount of slides, so I'm going to start my timer so I remember to stop waffling. Thank you very much on behalf of Collective Architecture for inviting us along to talk today. We're a practice based in Glasgow, obviously going to be a very much heard about in the next couple of weeks with COP26. We have studios in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and we're an employee-owned practice with over 50 colleagues. The practice was set up about 20 years ago, and the slide that you're seeing is the Beat Recycling Centre, which is a project completed in 2004, and was really the project where we put our money where our mouth was and started to think about recycling and about sustainability. And really this project was an exercise in looking at mill finished aluminium, and obviously times have changed and we look at materials in different ways, but the windows were all seconds, they were leftovers from other projects. There were bricks that were not quite the right color, so they'd been gifted to us, they'd have gone to landfill. We worked very closely with the local community, and even the windows had got bits of local art and made from recycled pieces of glass. I suppose over time, those aspects of sustainability have changed quite a bit. And whilst we've looked at a lot of device-orientated solutions and combined heat and power plants and wind turbines and what have you, we are now moving on to looking at the fabric of the buildings as the main way of tackling climate change. And we've kind of formalized our approach as a way, I suppose, of bringing people along on the journey. And this talk is called Existing Buildings, Who Decides What is Demolished and What is Kept? And I suppose a lot of that is about changing people's mindsets. And Collective Energy is a specialist division within the office, which is completely embedded in our architecture, but it's being spearheaded by a good few number of my colleagues, our Passive House accredited architects, and Chris, Rupert, and also James. So we're looking at building performance, and again, just reiterating some of those comments, in terms of building stock, 80% of the buildings which we have now will still be in use in 2050. So we've got a lot of retrofitting to do, and we all know that the buildings we're building now will still need to be retrofitted. We're pushing Passive House, and again, you all know about Passive House, so I won't talk about that too much. And Chris and a number of other colleagues are looking at the circular economy, as indeed everybody is and should be doing. So the case for never demolishing another building, there's been a lot of discussion about how the best building is the building we've already got, etc., etc. I teach at the Mackintosh School of Architecture in Stage 4. We do a lot of work in the city of Glasgow, and yesterday we're doing final reviews, and this slide popped up from one of the students, and I felt like I'd been foisted on my own petard. Not every building is worth keeping, Nick Walker. Apparently I said that. But I suppose it's more about, it's interesting to see young students and their sort of nervousness at demolishing anything, even if it's the single story remain of a shop that used to be part of a tenement. And I think sometimes we need to look at a broader sort of reading of the city in terms of, some of those remnants of buildings which we shouldn't hold on to for the sake of the city. And the area we're looking at there is the Barrows Market, which is pretty poor, has suffered a lot from a lack of investment, and a lot of the urban fabric is the remains of tenements that have disappeared, and the shops remain. I suppose I've done a bit of reflection in terms of just looking at what the office has done over the years and how we've engaged with communities, and whether that be sort of looking at identity through lighting or reusing shops as museums, repurposing buildings into business centres, or helping universities to upgrade their stock. Again, about identity and about creation of visitor facilities with the Titan Crane back in 2007. We've got a culture hub on site in Paisley at the moment, which uses an existing building, and reviews the department store frontage, our fantastic project on Carlton Hill, which is a mix of existing and new, the refurbishment of the Watt Institute, Glasgow Women's Library. I think you get the message. We've been doing this for quite a while, and sometimes we forget. And these two projects are where we've repurposed an old tram building, but also the old courthouse on Rothsea on the right-hand side. And these have been turned into social housing. And again, coming back to this decision about who decides what is kept and what is retained, as architects, sometimes there's a lot of legwork that has to be put in to make people realize that, you know, it's worth putting in that extra effort to retain buildings. And more recently, we've started getting acknowledgement in sort of through the Retrofit Awards. So I'm going to touch on two examples very quickly of buildings I've been involved with, and then move on to three others. And I suppose this really charts the changes in the way the office approaches in terms of how things are becoming more technical, but it also highlights all the other issues that are involved in terms of who decides. So this is a case of demolition. This slide shows the street pattern from the Victorian area and the street pattern after the comprehensive redevelopment in the 1960s. So this is what we were asked to look at by a social housing landlord, registered social housing landlord. And I think the picture on the bottom left really sort of shows the lack of sort of reference to the surrounding context. And this area of Anderston had been kind of cut off by the peculiar decisions of the planners back in the late 1960s. So whilst we thought about retaining the buildings, and this is a good sort of 8-9 years ago, there was very little sort of support from any of the rest of the people involved in the project. So it sort of came about as a result of the building of the motorway and the comprehensive redevelopment of Glasgow. And you can see the impact there on the slide at the bottom left, this huge swathe of the city, which was demolished to make way for the car. And again, sort of thinking about public opinion, you know, these flats, whilst the insides of them, the spaces were enjoyed, they weren't well loved because they leaked and they were cold. So the original sort of context was lost. This is what was put in its place. And what we did was looked at the original sort of street layout, the comprehensive redevelopment layout, and we tried to provide new homes that tied back into their context, and which obviously were of better construction and better at saving energy. So those pictures at the bottom sort of show the comparisons. In terms of on an urban scale, it's really tying the building back into its surrounding context and reconnecting roots. And you can see this very clearly from the air. So in this one, I suppose there were a lot of people involved in the decision that it shouldn't be retained. For the Victoria on the south side of Glasgow, which is currently on site, it's an ex-NHS hospital. There's a listed building on the site. We bid for the site with our client, again, a registered social landlord, bid for the site. And we were the only bidders who put in a proposal to actually keep some of the buildings. We would like to have kept more of the buildings, but economically it was not viable. So that obviously led to the destruction of some of the buildings that were there. And these had accrued over time. There were sort of Victorian buildings, 30s buildings, 60s buildings. And our process was to really sort of strip it back, keep those Nightingale pavilions as part of the identity and context and the things that people really thought about as being the hospital, and build on that and sort of create a legible route through the site, make it very open and public. So this is on site currently, but you can see the importance of those Nightingale wards within the local context of Langside. This will be 413 units. So now moving into three specific proposals, and I'm very wary of my time. This is a project that has been in the office for a good sort of 15, 16 years. And in that time, the building fabric deteriorated. And what I mean by that is we were asked to look at it 15, 16 years ago, and it sort of changed hands. It's an old stables that was related to cleansing, which has been converted into 52 mid-market affordable rent flats. Great red brick building, red sandstone building. It was clearly in a bad state and was in danger of being demolished if nothing happened soon, which is what happened to the Alexander Greek Thompson opposite. But, you know, a fantastic piece of history and great potential. So yes, demolition had been considered because of the length of time it had been empty. But thankfully, we managed to get this moving. We had a fantastic client, the Wheatley Group, who were really supportive in terms of refurbishing this building. And it's been turned into these wonderful flats, which are mid-market rent, great sense of community, a really fantastic asset for the city. So it's an existing sandstone building, so obviously insulation and energy conservation methods have been applied to the inside of the building. This is my colleague Andy Cardwell was project architect for this. But it's a terrific example of reusing existing buildings and imagining them in a new way. Second project is one that Will Hurst touched on, is the Cedar Towers, 1970s tower blocks, 400 homes, and it's was in a bad state of repair. That's 400 homes across the whole site. So we've been working on this again for a long time, since 2012, and we had short, medium, and long-term ways of looking at the whole site in terms of the externals, the building fabrics, and ways of repairing and making the whole area much more sustainable. But it's a fantastic community, really, really tightly knit community. They were involved in a lot of consultations. And what the Housing Association discovered was that the residents really loved their homes and they wanted to stay put. But, you know, we discovered through going in and doing research, or rather my colleague Rupert did, that fuel poverty was a massive issue. And some of the residents were only able to heat one room. So we looked at ways of improving the fabric of the building to as close to NFIT standards as possible. So the whole building has been overcovered in render with insulation. The major big change was to encapsulate the external balconies, which were massive cold bridges, and provide better amenity space. So there's a lot of research has gone into this, and it's a real sort of exemplar of how you can take a building that is fabrically quite difficult to justify, and make it into something where, you know, the amount of energy that is lost is significantly reduced. Duplex flats. And the image at the top right-hand corner sort of shows what has happened since the retrofit in terms of the amount of energy that's now being lost. So it fits in well into its context. I think I'm not going to touch on these slides because this is not my speciality. This is really Rupert, but it's just to show all of the analysis that has gone in behind this project. The amount of testing out windows, thinking about those thermal bridges, and it's well loved. And finally, sort of as we move into a more and more sort of a building analysis, this is another fantastic client who really wants to push this small printing works into a building that showcased what we can do with retrofit. So Rob has been really clever in accessing funds, and we've helped him. My colleagues Rupert and Emily have supported him along the way. But it's, again, retrofitted to NFIT standards, looking at high levels of insulation, air tightness, reducing thermal bridges. You all know this stuff. And it's been done in phases to suit the amount of funding that's available. So again, in terms of the slide at the bottom really shows you the reduction in the amount of proposed annual heating demand as a result of these changes. It's an 87% reduction in space heating demand, which is phenomenal. And it's a great sort of social building that has a kitchen and also is used as a social space for lots of organizations. So it was a step-by-step retrofit strategy, lots of checking on site. The client got involved with doing all of the air tightness taping himself to save on costs. So again, it's tricky in terms of getting rid of all of those sort of cold bridges. But we also got obviously air tightness testing done, and we're now carefully looking at the performance of the building and taking that knowledge forward. And so here we've got, a really fantastic client. The contractor was really on board, and Rupert has really pushed this to see what we can get out of an existing building. And we'll continue that with looking at other sort of add-ons in terms of adding to the solar array, the PVs on the roof. We've now pushed into, as a previous speaker talked about, it's sort of the volume and looking at the North Lanarkshire Council, providing them with input in terms of their existing housing stock. So they've got 32,000 homes, which will still exist in 2045, which means that they need to retrofit 3,000 homes a year, which is 9 homes a day, which is an enormous task. And finally, I just wanted to touch on something that a lot of other speakers have talked about, which is, who decides on what we retain and what we demolish. It comes back to government and VAT. So we've heard a lot about VAT today, but you see these terrible stories about, communities trying to retrofit existing buildings, but just not being able to because the costs are just unsupportable. So in terms of answering that question very quickly, it's all of these people involved in deciding what we retain and what we demolish. And we need to change the balance towards retention, but we still need to be careful that we look into the buildings that we are retaining to make sure that they fit within the urban fabric. And to finish, a quick slide of the concrete hippos at Anderston, which were taken away, refurbished, brought back, and are now part of the new landscape. And I think this is just a great quote at the end: a building or place that is well loved and well used is truly sustainable in the broadest sense of the word. And sorry for going over a bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. And very interesting to hear what collective architecture and you and your colleagues are up to now and pushing forward with your own beliefs in the sustainability factors and what needs to be done with net zero. I think we'll keep moving along, if that's okay. If you could stay with us, we'll get questions and answers at the end of this session. Our final speaker in session 2 is Professor Ken Gibb, who is Director and Principal Investigator of the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, which is quite a mouthful. Professor Gibb is a Director and Principal of this centre and is Professor of Housing Economics within the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Glasgow. He was formerly a Director of Policy Scotland and was co-director of What Works Scotland. So please, Ken, can I hand over to you for your talk?
Thanks very much, Andrew. I think hopefully my talk's going to complement what Nick has just been going through. I'm going to talk about a specific tenement retrofit in Glasgow, which is an ongoing project. And I'm going to do 4 things, really. I'm going to start by identifying the challenges, then say something about the specific project that's underway. Thirdly, about the multi-strand evaluations that we are taking on this, and then finish off by saying something about the lessons that we've learned thus far. So to start with the challenges, those of you who know Glasgow will know that it can be fairly described as a tenemental city. Something like 1/4 to 1/5 of all people in the city live in tenement flats. The great majority of those, more than 70,000, are traditional pre-1919 red sandstone or blonde sandstone buildings. They were, to a large extent, significantly refurbished in the period between the 70s and the 90s. But even those properties, largely now in the social housing sector, are in need of further major repair and investment. And why tenements are so interesting, I think, is because they are so challenging. They are owned by different people within individual closes or walk upstairs. They are in different tenures. In some parts of the city, they're very popular and are very livable neighborhoods that they constitute. And in other places, they clearly have some quality and conditions issues that they have to deal with. And actually, in the last Scottish Parliament, there was a really interesting working party on worked on tenement maintenance, who identified a number of key issues that need to change with the law of tenements in Scotland. And that's, I would argue, is a necessary condition of how we actually move forward with the sustainability of this iconic part of our housing stock. They focus on issues to the need for legal homeowner associations, for mandatory inspections of property quality, and also to build up sinking funds. And there is now developments taking place which suggest that certainly that the Law Commission and legal legislation may actually become possible with that. But I think in essence, the tenement is kind of a dream for institutional economists who are interested in property rights, principal agent theory, and transactions costs, because all of those issues are writ large with trying to get collective decisions made in tenemental units. So the challenge, therefore, is how do we retrofit? How do we sustain this large problematic form of housing, which is so popular and loved by so much of people in Scotland? And that's kind of where we come in. So the project, secondly, to talk about the project, Glasgow City Council has had a policy in recent years, which is kind of a replica of policies going back to the 70s and 80s, where they worry that some inner city neighbourhoods are dominated by small-scale private landlordism, which can be problematic. So they've been encouraging and facilitating housing associations to buy back some of that property and take a kind of stake in the management and maintenance of those areas. And that's particularly true in places like Govan Hill in the south side of Glasgow. And it's on this basis that Southside Housing Association, who are a reasonably sized community-based association in Glasgow, took over a property called 107 Nidri Road, which is an 8-flat, all one-bed units, an empty block, so they had kind of full control over the property. And initially, as part of the deal, they were going to do a fairly basic refurbishment of these units. But they became aware, as I was aware actually, they became aware that there was a Scottish Funding Council climate emergency competition, which would fund a couple of research projects about the climate emergency. So their director, Patrick McGrath, got in touch with me and we had a chat. And 2 weeks later, we had built a partnership and put a bid in, and we got funded. We got funded for a £250,000 research evaluation, multi-strand evaluation of a project which would go from beyond being a basic refurbishment to being a Retrofit, retrofit, which would be the first of its kind in Glasgow in a traditional tenemental stock. And I think, to be honest, the project needed the kind of imprimatur of a large research project like this in order to make the case to people at the council and the government for additional funding. And it's certainly not my view, but it's the view of the other partners involved in the project that the evaluation itself helped create a kind of model where there could be a demonstration project here. We could see what the impact of trying to build this would actually look like, and encourage lessons to be learned, and potentially about scaling up to see what else could be done. So that's essentially what occurred, and I'll show you now, if I can share the screen. I'll show you the what the property looks like. And I'll just move on to thing. So this is 107 Nidri Road. It's an absolutely standard tenement property block. Just to the left of the photograph is the entrance to Queen's Park railway station, and it's not far from Pollokshaws Road. So it's right in the middle of the inner south side in the area which butts really between Govan Hill and Strathbungo East. That consists of 8 one-bed flats. So I'll return to my photos in a minute or two. So the project was launched in, we had the competition for the research in October 2019. We won it, and then we actually launched the project on the last day of February 2020. So 2 or 3 weeks into just actually scoping out what the retrofit would look like, there was a lockdown from COVID. And that caused all sorts of difficulties with the work, not just with not having construction on site, but it stopped our relationships, our developing relationships and agreements with the various parties involved in the project because they weren't at work either. So the consequence was that we actually only started the project on site with the construction company in April of this year. So it was well over a year late, but obviously unavoidable in the circumstances. And I think the interesting thing is that a lot of people began to take a view in the city and beyond that this project wasn't really ever going to happen. So it has been a transformative period really since April, as we've actually made really fantastic progress. It now looks like the site will be completed December or January, around so in a couple of months, or maybe into January, and then we'll be able to put some. Well, the landlord will be able to put some tenants into the property. So let me give you a sense of what we're actually doing. Again, I'll return to my slides. So this is the. I hope you can see this okay. This is the site poster, which is on site just now in Nidri Road, and you can see who the partners are. Construction firm, the CCG, John Gilbert Architects are leading the project on behalf of the client, South Side. The Scottish Funding Council are funding the evaluation, which has been carried out by ourselves, CASH, the UK Collaborative Centre, and colleagues at the University of Strathclyde, with the City Council and Scottish Government providing funding for the build project that's going on. So this is the view from the back and sort of internal cutaway of the property. So there is external wall insulation at the rear and the gable end at the side going on. There is internal wall insulation at the front of the building. There is triple glazing going in. There's work being done on the joists, stone repair. There's air source heat pumps, but there's also, we've retained some gas boilers for comparison purposes as well. There's wastewater heat recovery. There's going to be a mechanical ventilation as well, and the work is well advancing as we speak. So again, I'll come back to my slides later on. That's where we're going with that. Let me tell you a little bit about the evaluation that we're doing, so you can get a flavour for the research that's underway. I should have just stuck with my slides, shouldn't I? This will give you a feel for the kind of breadth of what we're trying to do. First of all, we are undertaking a evaluability assessment. We undertook an evaluability assessment. That's really an exercise at the beginning of the process to get buy-in from all of the partners to the importance of the evaluation and the knowledge that we want to get from it and the theory of change that underpins what we're trying to do. So we held 3 workshops, and I think that was very helpful. But the other thing, in a kind of evaluability sense, that was very helpful was that during lockdown, the 4 principals involved in the evaluation, the Housing Association, Tim Sharp at Strathclyde, Chris Morgan and John Gilberts and myself, we met every week or two to discuss the project, the evaluation, the progress, the things that weren't going well and the things could go better, etc. And that was very useful in itself. So evaluability assessment is I think good practice when you have a broad evaluation where there really isn't much precedent for what you're trying to do. Secondly, we have found as we go along that a kind of real-time action research assessment of decision making about the project has been fantastically useful. And that's in part about the decision making that happens on site or working with the contractor, thinking about how to do the project, but it's also about the decisions that are made because of our interaction with external bodies, like the City Council's planning department, for instance. We're doing a technical building performance assessment that Tim Sharp is leading on, and that will obviously carry on after the tenants are in the properties in the new year. We're undertaking a cost-benefit analysis that I'm leading on, which I'll talk more about in a few minutes. And we're going to have both a pre and post-occupancy survey to pick up on a point made earlier this morning about the importance of learning from how residents actually use the assets, as it were, once they're in them. So that's the kind of model that we're working on, and we'll carry on for at least another 6 months. So what are the lessons that we've learned so far? And I kind of group these into some specific and more general lessons, and I'll start with the specific lessons. Partnership's really important, and I know that people always say that, but the actual practicality of the partners trusting each other and building good relationships is really important. One of the lessons that we've learned also is that we think there's quite a poor degree of scalability of the specific lessons learned in any individual tenant because they are so idiosyncratic. So I think partnerships have to work well in each replicable case. You know, if you are working on a tenement in a different neighbourhood, you'd probably need a different combination of people and skills to work with. So, but you're not going to be able to do it without that partnership being effective. A second lesson, I think, is that we've found that through this external relationship with our partners, particularly the City Council, that we actually had to create precedent for planning policy reform in order to enable the retrofit to go forward. So a number of things we had to battle over included external wall insulation, the size of changes to windows or internal layouts, whether we could have larger guttering or not, a whole set of issues that basically there wasn't any debate about before because this hadn't been attempted before, but in the interest of that sustainability, it had to be worked through. We also found that, I mean, quite basically the bottom line is the key takeaway is that Retrofit is possible with tenements. We now firmly believe. We think it's going to be successful. That's obviously the performance of the building has yet to be demonstrated, however. Under the cost-benefit analysis work, what we know so far, and what we've tried to do is essentially compare the costs and benefits, including carbon-related issues with the help of John Gilbert architects. We've tried to compare that with two counterfactuals, the basic refurbishment and demolish a new build. And because of the embodied carbon costs, etc., we're kind of ignoring the new build work for all intents and purposes. But we've done a number of scenarios and we've found out, I guess, the following. First of all, clearly, because of the high upfront capital costs, the deep retrofit is quite expensive. You could say it's very expensive. It's about 30,000 a unit, as opposed to the much lower level of refurbishment work that would have taken place. However, on the first point, I guess it's worth saying that it is the case that the refurbishment work will have to be expanded on as time goes on, as we move towards our targets, towards net zero. In other words, there will have to be further investment in the refurbished property if that counterfactual had taken place. If it was social housing and it was going to meet H2 standards, for instance, it would still have to have further investment in it to meet net zero targets. So there's a sense in which there's further capital costs to be done to the counterfactual. Secondly, we think quite strongly that there are big performance gaps likely to emerge between the Retrofit retrofit and the refurbished property, that it will not achieve the things that it was proposed to achieve, because that's what the record and evidence tells us is true of other similar types of properties. We also recognise that only the Retrofit retrofit, in addition to these carbon issues, will generate something like 80 to 90% reductions in the costs of fuel that tenants experience. So there will be major changes to their fuel affordability and warmth. So all of those things are work that continues to be ongoing. A more general level, just to finish off, I think it's important to say that the scaling up issue is tricky and has to be thought through. One of the interesting things that the contractors tell us is that although this was an empty block, which was being extensively worked on over a period of 5 or 6 months, it's quite conceivable to imagine it being done without decanting with tenants inside it if there's a proper phased way of doing that. They were quite confident that they thought that that would be perfectly reasonable to do. Whether the residents would feel the same way is another matter, of course. But it's not simply a decanting issue, or it's not a binary. That's what we're saying. Secondly, I think, going back to my original points, it seems to me that all of this will become much more possible when tenement law reform takes hold, but that's going to take several years. There's no escaping that fact. And finally, there's been considerable interest in this project and the scope and the implications of the 107 Nidri Road project, and it's become quite popular with respect to COP26. So it's one of the 17 virtual pavilion global projects, which is quite a daunting thing for us. And we're also going to be presenting it in the Green Zone on a couple of occasions. And the way we're going to do that is we've made a film that some of you may have noticed in social media yesterday. We've made a film which was basically launched yesterday. It's called Nidri Road, a Blueprint for Energy Efficient Traditional Tenements. If you're interested in seeing it, it's about 50 minutes long and it's available on our YouTube channel, which is called Housing Evidence. We're going to be making a lot of use of that film, I suspect, over the next few months, but we're going to do a part 2 as well, because we are going to do the sort of post-occupancy survey bits and try and make sense of that in the film as well. So I'll stop at that point. I hope you found some of that interesting, at least, and it can help with the discussion to come. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Ken. And we've had two examples from both Nick and Ken dealing with Glasgow, which is appropriate, I think, for COP26 plus Germany from Thomas. So in terms of, we won't try and compare them, I don't think. I think that could be a real push, but I think, is there anything that came out of it in terms of, you know, Thomas, from what you've seen that's happening in Scotland and Glasgow, did you notice anything that was comparable to what you've been dealing with in Germany, or is it very much a different types of buildings, different problems?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of similarities in some way on, you know, that we understand that there is a big, you know, it's a big topic to discuss and to also solve. Yeah, I think what's a bit different is the scale of it, and also on the drivers. It might have to do also with the ownership structure, where we do have in Germany traditionally a lower ownership structure compared to other countries. And thus there is a little bit higher burden probably on the large housing developers, because they are providing, sometimes 60–70% of the housing that's available. So I think maybe that's the biggest difference. But I very much like it that it's, you know, very interesting to see the project. And I know Glasgow a little bit, but it's interesting to see that such, you know, wonderful projects are happening all different places. And it's great to be pretty much like a side tour happening, yeah, to see it and to spread the words. But I think ownership structure is a big topic, and just there was a good publication of the burdens on having your own home and buying your own home, and there was a big report in the US on similar topics. So that's getting increasingly difficult. That's then also reflecting on the level on who's playing part and who can bring the change. So that's just, you know, on you know, observation I made.
Thank you. I noticed with one of the things that you mentioned towards the end, Ken, was that it could potentially be done on a tenemental basis without the need for decanting. And I wondered how that compared with Nick in the high rise. I think there was no decanting in that. So how did that work? If I put it to you first, Nick.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, you're better speaking to my colleague Rupert for the full details, but that was part of the strategy, was that none of the residents were to move out of their homes, so they were there the whole time, and the only interventions were in terms of putting in the MVHR systems. And a couple of residents allowed us to use their properties to check and see what the results of the changes were. But everything had to be kept to the external fabric. And in that particular circumstance, very different to what Ken's dealing with the tenement, the external fabric was really of no consequence, although there were some very nice graphics on the side. And I'm very lucky I can actually see the 3 blocks directly out of my window here. So, but that was the way to do it. A decant would have been really, really difficult. There were other aspects of the project as well. We did upgrade the lifts, all of the entrance sequences. And now we're undergoing a process with well, the landscape architects have now taken it over to completely change all of the external spaces around, again with an idea to make sure that no one has to move out of their homes. But that was key from the beginning.
Thank you. I think, I suppose, Ken, one of the big problems with the tenemental types is that there's so many different forms of ownership, etc. So one assumes with collectives high-rise, it was all in the council control. But you said that you need changes to the law, but it was, you felt was possible to do it without decant? Ken?
Well, yeah, I think that's a couple of different issues. I think the tenemental law reform is trying to address issues that don't really pertain to the Midway Road project. They're part of the wider scaling up issue about how do you create an environment where people might, owners and private landlords might commit to a more collective action, because there'll be the sort of legal arrangements to make that more likely to occur. Basically what happened was we were on a site tour a couple of weeks ago with the minister, looking at the project, and it was just a throwaway comment by the clerk of works, who basically said, look, you know, we think there are lots of different ways where you could imagine a block like this with residents living in it, where you could work through the requirements of an NFIT retrofit without them having to actually leave their homes. Could phase it over a period of time. You could focus on the more common works and then room by room work on the individual units. So they definitely thought that was possible. Obviously, there are, you know, all these things are a trade-off, aren't they? There are costs and benefits to doing that. So I don't think it would be plain sailing, and I guess there'll be situations where it wouldn't be viable.
Andrew, just to add to that, it was a housing association property, so across the whole development, you know, as a result of the right to buy, which is no longer now enforced in Scotland, that there are owner occupiers, so that does make things more complicated, particularly if there are large costs associated with any retrofitting that might become the burden of an owner in amongst housing association tenants. So that's another sort of complexity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think changing it to a question of land ownership, Nicholas Foltz asked a question. I don't know, are you available, Nicholas, to put it yourself?
Yes, I am certainly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. The question I had, I think it was Ken Gibbs relating on the question of heating and humidity, but on land ownership, I was raising the question of cities like Vienna and Copenhagen seem to do so much better because the local authority seems to control so much more of the land. And I wonder if that was the case, whether the land value would come down, and we would then take a very different approach. We would make much more use of what existed and be less keen to develop on green fields. That was the question. Okay.
Well, I could probably, I mean, yeah, I think those issues about land ownership and land value uplift and those sorts of things are big, chronic, systemic sort of issues that pertain right across the housing system. And I wouldn't disagree. In relation to your comment about health issues and such, like, I mean, I should say first of all, I'm an economist by trade. I'm not a public health or building performance expert, but as I understand it from what my colleagues tell me, the key things here are, on the one hand, that proper mechanical ventilation. I think this is what Rupert says about Cedar Court as well, that proper ventilation allied to the air tightness obviates those kinds of problems with relation to humidity, provided that you have found a mechanism by which you can successfully train and teach the residents about the how to get the best out of the property, in particular to make those kind of fuel savings that I mentioned, and I know that have been found in Cedar Court as well. So I think that's part of this. I know there's an issue in energy economics, isn't there, about rebound, that some people, when they get this much more energy efficient kind of opportunity, they actually spend more on energy because before they had economized on it, and so there's a kind of rebound and you don't get the saving that you might have wanted to. But it does seem that with effective Retrofit, with good ventilation and with appropriate training, it can be made to work.
Ken, I too am an economist, and I know, for example, from Joseph Rountree's research, where they did a similar sort of project, that the architect didn't understand what was really required. The builder didn't know how to build it, and the tenants certainly didn't know how to use it. So there were none of the savings that were expected were achieved. And I think we have to, as economists, start with people as they are, not people as they might theoretically be.
Absolutely. I think this comes back to what I think I was trying to touch on in my talk, but probably rushed through it because I had far too many slides. But really, it's something that's dear to the heart of the Academy, which is about collaborative working and non-siloed ways of working. Because I think when we undergo any process, everybody's in their own little camp, and the things that we have to go through are clients' misconceptions. So there's a lot of education for clients. Why are clients still putting boilers in? Because they know how to use boilers and they're scared of the alternatives until legislation forces them to. QSs automatically assume that anything that is to do with retrofit is expensive, or any other form of heating is expensive, and they always have the client's ear. So, and contractors are very reluctant to move away from what they know best. So us as architects, I mean, it's incredibly frustrating because you're always trying to do your best, but you've got to cajole everyone else along. And at the end of the day, there's a specific pot of money. So one of the things that I find quite frustrating in construction at the moment, or in architecture, is there is a finite pot of money which is given by the Scottish government via the UK government to build social housing, but we have wonderful initiatives like the Glasgow Standard for increasing space standards within properties. We're increasing our levels of insulation, but the money is not getting any bigger. So as a result of that, we're having to do curious things like start using UPVC windows, which we have never ever done before, but the costs will not stack up. And it's the first thing that the QSs go for, is the windows, which is completely contrary to the emergency that the climate is currently dealing with, and will deal with for millennia. We have to all do this together, and we have to find a way that everyone can understand the long-term benefits and the long-term economics of these changes we're trying to put in place.
I mean, I guess I would add to that and say that I came into this with no background in this work area at all, and I've been really struck how the architects, the association, and the builders really seem to understand the difficulties and the problems with the things that they have to work with. And there's undoubtedly a major challenge about making the properties as simple to use for tenants, for the residents, and that would be equally applied to homeowners or anybody else who's living in it. And there's, you know, there's been a lot of intelligence gone into thinking, how do you best frame and present these things to try to make them as effective as possible. And I was been really struck in the last few days by, in the Cedar Court example, there's a nice presentation that that the Housing Association do, Queen's Cross do for it, where they have a tenant who makes the point about, you know, he has had no problem at all managing the heat in the building with the ventilation, and says, the only time I open the windows I have to wash them. You know, he gets it. He's getting a huge reduction in his costs by using the thing appropriately. So I suppose there are some learned revealed preferences, if you want to put it that way, some economic incentives in that, but I don't for a second disregard how challenging that's going to be, and I guess there's a real opportunity there to at the bigger scale to think about what are the best ways, what really works in that kind of space, of how you help to allow people to make the best of the great opportunity that these things can provide.
And I suppose, you know, not being negative, where we're actually getting to now is we are getting ahead of steam, and we are getting people beginning to understand that these things are possible and they are economically viable. And that's why, you know, discussions like today are so important in terms of changing people's mindsets. And as one of the previous speakers talked about, you know, the big sort of pension funds and what have you are now getting behind retrofit because they can see money in it, whereas before they couldn't.
I think that was raised certainly earlier in terms of investments, and I think Thomas raised it as well, if I remember correctly. We've reached the end of our second session, or at least the timing that Stephen has allowed us. So a big thanks to Thomas, to Nick, to Ken. Thank you very much indeed for excellent chats. Here's hoping that when we come along to COP26 that they have been listening. Some of these presentations are going to make their way to the delegates, or at least to probably the admin people in particular who will be working away on what is actually going to be determined. But we all know what we need to do, and I think it's a question in many ways that we were discussing today is, you know, can it be done? How can it be done? How do you present it? And I think everybody's agreed that the issue of, for instance, the communities, the people who are going to use those buildings or live near those buildings, you can't ignore them from the technical chat. They have to understand what this is about, appreciate it, and probably they'll be the drivers for change as we move forward. So thank you very much indeed.